March 1941. Liverpool's docks burn for the seventh consecutive night while somewhere in Kent, a 15-year-old grammar school girl stares at white powder on her fingers, her hands trembling with realization. The substance coating her palms possesses a property that contradicts every physics textbook she's studied, a property that might solve Britain's most lethal problem. German U-boats are sinking supply convoys faster than the Royal Navy can replace them. Within 6 months, her impossible discovery will send 40 enemy submarines to the ocean floor. But tonight, as incendiary bombs whistle overhead, she doesn't yet understand that her chemistry homework is about to change the course of the Battle of the Atlantic. 15th March 1941, 22:47 hours. Dorothy Ainsworth pressed her forehead against the cold window pane of her family's Anderson shelter in Whitstable, Kent, watching orange flames dance across the horizon where German bombers had struck the harbour installations. The acrid smell of burning cordite mixed with salt air drifted through ventilation gaps. Her father, a merchant Navy wireless operator, had been missing for 3 weeks after his convoy scattered under U-boat attack somewhere in the western approaches. Her mother sat motionless in the corner, clutching his last letter, the paper worn thin from constant reading. Dorothy was 15 years old, a scholarship student at Whitstable Grammar School for Girls, daughter of a working-class family who'd sacrificed everything to keep her in education whilst the war consumed Britain's future. She possessed her father's methodical mind and her mother's stubborn refusal to accept defeat. Tonight, whilst waiting for the all-clear, she'd been reviewing her advanced chemistry coursework by candlelight, specifically examining the molecular structure of calcium carbonate, the compound forming the white chalk cliffs that dominated Kent's coastline. The strategic situation was catastrophic beyond public acknowledgement. Between January and March 1941, German U-boats had sunk 142 British merchant vessels, totaling over 500,000 tons. Supply convoys crossing the Atlantic were being decimated at a rate that made Britain's survival increasingly doubtful. The island nation depended absolutely on maritime supply lines. Food, fuel, ammunition, raw materials all arrived by ship or didn't arrive at all. Admiral Karl Donitz's submarine fleet operated with near impunity in the western approaches, the vast oceanic hunting ground where convoys converged before approaching British ports. British destroyers possessed ASDIC sonar detection systems, but the technology was primitive, unreliable, and easily confused by thermal layers, schools of fish, and deliberate countermeasures. The operational challenge was brutally simple. British escort vessels couldn't detect submerged U-boats with sufficient reliability to prevent torpedo attacks. ASDIC functioned adequately under perfect conditions, but the Atlantic provided perfect conditions approximately never. Temperature variations created acoustic shadows, where submarines vanished from detection. Mechanical limitations meant ASDIC lost contact at close range, exactly when destroyers needed targeting information most desperately. U-boats hunted in packs, coordinating attacks that overwhelmed escort defenses, whilst merchant vessels burned and sank, taking their irreplaceable cargo and crew to the bottom. Dorothy understood these realities with painful intimacy. Her father's letters, arriving irregularly through naval mail, had described the terror of convoy duty, the sudden explosions in darkness as torpedoes struck, the screams of men drowning in oil-slicked water, the helplessness of escort vessels searching blindly whilst submarines slipped away beneath the waves. His last letter, dated 23rd of February, had been written hours before his convoy was attacked. 17 ships sunk, 342 men lost. Her father's vessel, SS Merchant Prince, had transmitted an SOS before going silent forever. The statistical reality was even grimmer than personal tragedy suggested. British shipyards were constructing replacement vessels at maximum capacity, but construction required 12 to 18 months per ship, whilst U-boats sank merchantmen in minutes. The rate of destruction exceeded replacement by a factor that meant Britain would exhaust its merchant fleet within 2 years, unless something fundamental changed. Food rationing had been tightened to starvation levels. Fuel reserves diminished weekly. Military operations depended on supply lines that were progressively failing. The government maintained public morale through careful censorship, but anyone with basic arithmetic could calculate that Britain was losing the Battle of the Atlantic, and losing the Atlantic meant losing the war. Dorothy's chemistry homework that night concerned the properties of calcium carbonate, specifically its behavior under varying pressure conditions. Kent's famous white cliffs consisted of chalk formed from ancient marine organisms, compressed over millions of years into sedimentary rock. The assignment required students to analyze how calcium carbonate's molecular structure responded to temperature and pressure variations, a theoretical exercise meant to reinforce understanding of chemical bonds. She'd been conducting small-scale experiments using chalk samples collected from the cliffs near her home, heating fragments over a Bunsen burner, immersing them in water baths at different temperatures, crushing samples to examine their physical characteristics. The work was meticulous, tedious, and ordinarily would have produced entirely predictable results, documented in every chemistry textbook published in the last century. Except tonight, something impossible happened. Dorothy had prepared a suspension of finely powdered chalk in seawater collected from Whitstable Harbour, intending to observe how salinity affected dissolution rates. She'd used a clean glass beaker, measured quantities precisely, maintained careful records. The mixture should have behaved according to established chemistry, calcium carbonate partially dissolving, creating a milky suspension, settling gradually over several hours. Instead, the suspension began exhibiting luminescence. At first, she'd assumed contamination, perhaps phosphorescent plankton in the seawater sample. She prepared fresh samples using distilled water, then seawater collected from different locations, then seawater filtered through laboratory paper. Each time, within 15 to 20 minutes, the chalk suspension began emitting faint blue-green light, visible clearly in the shelter's darkness. The luminescence wasn't constant, but pulsed irregularly, responding to vibrations. When she tapped the beaker, the glow intensified momentarily before fading to baseline. Dorothy conducted systematic tests with the methodical precision her father had always encouraged. She prepared control samples using limestone powder, clay, talc, and other mineral powders. None exhibited luminescence. She tested chalk samples from different cliff locations. All glowed. She varied water temperature, salinity concentration, and mixing ratios. The effect persisted with remarkable consistency. She documented everything in her laboratory notebook with the same careful handwriting she'd learned from copying her father's wireless logs. The scientific explanation eluded her completely. Calcium carbonate possessed no known luminescent properties. The phenomenon contradicted established chemistry. She'd obviously made some fundamental error in methodology or observation. Except the effect was reproducible, consistent, and undeniably real. The chalk glowed in seawater, particularly when subjected to vibration or pressure changes. The all-clear siren sounded at 01:15 hours. Her mother climbed wearily from the shelter, heading into the house without speaking. Dorothy remained behind, staring at her glowing beakers, her mind racing through implications she couldn't yet articulate. Somewhere in her subconscious, connections were forming. Chalk extracted from Kent's cliffs, seawater, luminescence responding to vibration. The Battle of the Atlantic, U-boats moving through darkness beneath the waves, invisible to detection, untouchable by conventional weapons, ships sinking, men drowning. Her father gone forever because British technology couldn't find submarines hiding in the ocean's depths. She didn't sleep that night. By dawn, she'd filled 12 pages with observations, hypotheses, and calculations. The idea forming in her mind seemed absurd, impossible, the desperate fantasy of a grief-stricken schoolgirl. But the samples continued glowing, pulsing faintly in the grey morning light, filtering through the shelter's entrance, responding to vibrations from her footsteps, whispering that perhaps, impossibly, she'd discovered something that mattered. By Monday morning, she'd made a decision that would require courage she didn't yet know she possessed. She would take her findings to someone who might understand their significance, someone who might see past the absurdity of a 15-year-old girl claiming to have discovered something that could help win the war. She would face skepticism, dismissal, and probably ridicule. But accepting her father's death without trying to prevent others from sharing his fate was simply impossible. Dorothy Ainsworth, grammar school scholarship student, daughter of a lost merchant seaman, refused to accept that brilliant men with advanced degrees and unlimited resources had exhausted all possibilities. Sometimes, she believed fiercely, breakthroughs came from unexpected places, from people who didn't know enough to understand what was supposed to be impossible. 18th March 1941, 09:30 hours. Dorothy stood outside Professor Edmund Harrington's office at the University of Kent's Department of Applied Chemistry, her school uniform damp from cycling through morning drizzle, her satchel containing samples, notebooks, and carefully sealed glass vials of glowing chalk suspension. The secretary had already informed her twice that the professor was extremely busy, that unsolicited visits from school children were inappropriate, that research facilities were restricted to authorized personnel under wartime protocols. Dorothy had responded each time with polite determination, refusing to leave until Professor Harrington himself told her to go away. The professor was 63 years old, a specialist in marine chemistry who'd spent 4 decades studying oceanic conditions, chemical composition of seawater, and interactions between minerals and maritime environments. Before the war, he'd published extensively on calcium carbonate formation in marine organisms. Since September 1939, he'd been conscripted into government research programs attempting to improve submarine detection methods, specifically investigating whether chemical markers could identify submerged vessels or create visible traces in their wake. Every approach had failed comprehensively. The British research establishment was desperately pursuing any conceivable method to detect U-boats more effectively than Asdica's unreliable acoustic pings. Chemical detection programs had tested hundreds of compounds, seeking reactions that might betray submarine presence. Substances responding to diesel exhaust, compounds detecting metal corrosion, traces revealing disturbed water patterns. Each promising theory had collapsed when confronted with the ocean's brutal reality: infinite dilution, chaotic mixing, thermal disruption, biological contamination. The sea was simply too vast, too dynamic, too chemically complex for any practical detection method beyond direct acoustic reflection. Professor Harrington had personally overseen 37 failed detection experiments over the past 18 months. He was exhausted, frustrated, and increasingly convinced that chemical detection represented an intellectual dead end, pursued only because alternatives were equally hopeless. His mood that morning, as he reviewed another negative test report from Admiralty facilities, was profoundly pessimistic. When his secretary finally admitted the persistent schoolgirl who'd been haunting his waiting area for 90 minutes, his initial reaction was impatience barely suppressed by professional courtesy. He had preparations for critical experiments requiring attention, bureaucratic reports demanding completion, military liaison meetings consuming entire afternoons. He had no time for whatever earnest but misguided science project this child wanted to discuss. Dorothy recognized his skepticism immediately. She'd anticipated it, prepared for it, decided that her only chance was absolute directness combined with immediate demonstration. Before Professor Harrington could deliver the polite dismissal forming on his lips, she'd removed a sealed glass vial from her satchel and placed it on his desk. "This is chalk powder suspended in seawater collected from Whitstable Harbour," she stated quietly, her voice steady despite hammering heartbeat. "It exhibits luminescence when subjected to vibration or pressure changes. No chemistry textbook explains why. I believe it might be relevant to submarine detection, but I need someone with proper equipment and expertise to determine whether I'm correct or simply making a fool of myself. Professor Harrington's dismissal died unspoken as he stared at the vial. Even in the office's harsh electric lighting, faint blue-green luminescence was visible in the suspension, pulsing irregularly. When Dorothy deliberately tapped the desk, the glow intensified momentarily, creating visible patterns in the fluid before fading. 60 seconds of silence followed. Then the professor stood, walked to the window to examine the vial in natural light, returned to his desk, picked up a fountain pen, and tapped the vial's base. The luminescence surged. He set the vial down carefully, as though it might explode, and looked at Dorothy with an expression she couldn't interpret. "You collected this chalk from the Kent cliffs." His voice was carefully neutral. "Yes, sir. Multiple locations. The effect appears consistent regardless of collection site. And you've tested this with different water samples?" "Sea water from various locations, distilled water, tap water. Sea water produces the strongest luminescence. I've documented all procedures and results." She removed her laboratory notebook from the satchel, offering it. Professor Harrington spent the next 40 minutes reading Dorothy's meticulous notes whilst conducting his own preliminary tests with the sample. He prepared fresh suspensions using his laboratory-grade equipment, tested responses to vibration, temperature, and pressure variations, compared results against control samples using limestone and other carbonate minerals. The Kent chalk exhibited unique, luminescent properties that defied his 4 decades of chemical expertise. The implications were staggering if the effect could be scaled and applied practically. Submarines moving through seawater created pressure waves, vibrations, turbulence. If chalk suspensions responded visibly to these disturbances, if the reaction was sensitive enough and persistent enough, if contamination could be controlled and false positives minimized, then potentially, impossibly, a schoolgirl conducting homework experiments had discovered a detection method that Britain's entire scientific establishment had failed to identify. "Miss Ainsworth," the professor said finally, his voice betraying carefully controlled excitement, "I need you to understand that what you've brought me is either a complete anomaly that will disappear under rigorous testing, or it represents something genuinely significant. The probability of the latter is vanishingly small. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir. But vanishingly small is larger than zero." He smiled, the first genuine smile that had crossed his face in months. "Indeed it is. Would you be willing to work with me and my research team to investigate this properly? With your parents' permission, of course." Dorothy's mother, when contacted that afternoon, responded with the fierce pragmatism of women who'd watched their men sail into danger whilst they maintained the home front. If her daughter's schoolwork might help prevent other families from receiving telegrams announcing death at sea, then obviously she would cooperate fully. The headmistress of Whitstable Grammar School, equally pragmatic, arranged for Dorothy to spend 3 afternoons weekly at the university laboratory whilst maintaining her academic progress. What followed was a compressed research program conducted under pressure that would have broken civilian scientists unaccustomed to wartime urgency. Professor Harrington assembled a small team. 2 marine chemists, a physicist specializing in fluid dynamics, a biologist expert in luminescent marine organisms, and Dorothy herself, who possessed intuitive understanding of the phenomenon that academic training couldn't replicate. They worked in basement laboratories with blacked-out windows, testing samples under conditions replicating oceanic environments. Large pressure tanks simulated depths where U-boats operated. Wave generators created turbulence patterns. Temperature controls replicated Atlantic conditions ranging from Arctic cold to Gulf Stream warmth. Every variable was tested systematically, results documented obsessively, failures analyzed as rigorously as successes. The chalk's luminescence proved remarkably robust. Kent chalk specifically, formed from particular Cretaceous deposits, contained trace minerals that catalyzed bioluminescent reactions when suspended in seawater. The effect was biological in origin. Dormant bacteria embedded in the chalk's porous structure activated when exposed to saline solution and mechanical disturbance. The bacteria were extremophiles that had survived millions of years in geological strata, awakening when conditions matched their ancient marine origins. The luminescence responded to pressure waves with sensitivity exceeding ASDIC's acoustic detection, reacting to submarine movement at ranges where sonar produced only ambiguous echoes. By mid-April, Professor Harrington had compiled sufficient data to approach the Admiralty with a proposal that would have seemed insane 6 weeks earlier. He had academic credentials, wartime security clearance, and exhaustive documentation. Most importantly, he had repeatable experimental results demonstrating genuine detection capability. The Admiralty response was skeptical, verging on hostile. Chemical detection had consumed enormous resources, producing zero operational results. The proposal that chalk powder from Kent could outperform sophisticated acoustic systems seemed preposterous. Multiple committees reviewed the research, demanding additional testing, questioning methodology, highlighting obvious practical obstacles to naval deployment. Professor Harrington presented Dorothy's original samples at a critical review meeting attended by senior naval officers, submarine specialists, and scientific advisors. He conducted live demonstrations, creating pressure pulses that triggered visible luminescence, whilst ASDIC equipment detected nothing. The effect was undeniable, reproducible, and frankly baffling to observers who'd spent careers believing they understood oceanic detection completely. On 3 May 1941, the Admiralty authorized limited operational testing. One destroyer, HMS Watchful, would be equipped with experimental detection apparatus to evaluate whether laboratory results translated into practical submarine detection capability. The timeline was brutally compressed. Equipment design, manufacturing, installation and testing within 6 weeks. Failure meant termination of the entire program. Success meant expanded deployment that might possibly begin inflicting significant losses on U-boat forces that had operated with near immunity for too long. Dorothy returned to her school desk that afternoon, exhausted and quietly terrified that her discovery would prove useless when confronted with the Atlantic's harsh reality, that she'd raised desperate hopes that would be crushed like so many previous promises of technological salvation. But the alternative, doing nothing, accepting defeat, mourning her father without attempting to transform grief into purpose, was simply impossible to contemplate. 12th of June 1941, 03:20 hours. HMS Watchful rolled through heavy Atlantic swells 200 miles west of Ireland, maintaining silent escort duty on convoy HX-130's starboard flank. Commander James Thornton stood on the destroyer's bridge, studying the dark water, whilst his vessel's experimental detection system processed data from arrays deployed along both sides of the hull. The system consisted of perforated tubes containing chalk suspension under controlled pressure, with observation ports allowing crew members to monitor luminescence patterns visually, whilst photoelectric sensors provided quantitative measurements. The apparatus looked absurd, the improvised creation of scientists who'd never experienced combat conditions. Civilian researchers had assured Commander Thornton that the system would detect submerged submarines through pressure wave responses that exceeded ASDIC capability. He remained profoundly skeptical, but Admiralty orders were explicit. Evaluate the detection system under operational conditions, engage any contacts, document all results. Watchful's crew had trained intensively for 3 weeks, learning to interpret luminescence patterns, coordinate visual observation with electronic monitoring, integrate new detection capability with established tactical procedures. The Atlantic that night was moderately rough, with 12-foot swells and occasional rain squalls, reducing visibility to a few hundred yards. Conditions were perfect for U-boat attacks, sufficient weather to complicate escort coordination without preventing submarine operations. The convoy consisted of 32 merchant vessels carrying food, ammunition, and aviation fuel desperately needed in Britain. 5 destroyers provided escort, their ASDIC systems probing the darkness ineffectively, whilst knowing that somewhere in the surrounding ocean, German submarines were maneuvering for attack positions. At 03:47 hours, the watch officer monitoring Watchful's experimental detection arrays reported anomalous luminescence patterns in the starboard tubes. The observation was tentative, uncertain, potentially meaningless fluctuation caused by wave action or biological contamination. Commander Thornton examined the arrays personally, watching faint pulses ripple through the chalk suspension in patterns that suggested rhythmic disturbance rather than random turbulence. "Range estimate?" he demanded. "Difficult to determine, sir. Pattern suggests pressure source approximately 800 yards starboard, depth 50 to 70 feet based on wave propagation analysis. 800 yards exceeded ASDIC effective range under current acoustic conditions." Thornton ordered his sonar operators to focus on the indicated bearing. They reported no contact, only the usual confusion of thermal layers and biological echoes that rendered acoustic detection nearly useless. The luminescence patterns intensified. Rhythmic pulses suggested propeller beats, the distinctive signature of submarine diesels driving vessels through water at periscope depth. Thornton faced an immediate decision: commit to an attack based on unproven detection technology that contradicted established acoustic systems, or ignore potentially critical intelligence because it derived from chalk powder rather than sophisticated electronics. He'd lost 2 ships under his command to U-boat attacks over the previous year, 23 officers and ratings dead, drowned in burning oil, screaming for help that arrived too late. The memories informed his decision instantaneously. Action stations: prepare depth charge attack bearing 270, range estimated 800 yards. Fire on my command. Watchful surged forward, increasing speed to 20 knots, closing on the luminescence source whilst crew raced to battle positions. The experimental detection system tracked target movement with precision impossible for ASDIC under current conditions, updating continuously as the U-boat maneuvered, apparently oblivious to British approach. At 03:52 hours, having closed to 400 yards with luminescence patterns indicating target directly ahead at 60-foot depth, Commander Thornton ordered depth charge release. 10 Mark 7 charges tumbled from Watchful's stern racks, their hydrostatic fuses set for 50 and 75-foot detonation depths. The destroyer accelerated clear of the explosion zone, creating separation whilst awaiting results. The ocean erupted. 10 massive explosions created columns of white water visible even in darkness, shockwaves radiating outward, pressure pulses devastating to any submarine caught within lethal radius. Watchful's crew watched through night glasses, searching for debris, oil slicks, survival evidence indicating successful kill. Nothing visible emerged immediately. Commander Thornton ordered a second attack run, maneuvering for optimal positioning based on luminescence tracking that suggested the target was still moving, but erratically, possibly damaged. 2 additional depth charge patterns exploded, creating overlapping destruction zones that left no escape room for submerged vessels. At 04:09 hours, debris began surfacing: wooden fragments, cork insulation, oil slicks spreading across wave crests, and finally, unmistakably, human bodies wearing German naval uniforms. HMS Watchful had achieved a confirmed U-boat kill using detection technology developed from a schoolgirl's chemistry homework, conducted in an Anderson shelter whilst bombers burned the horizon. The news reached London by encrypted wireless transmission at 05:30 hours. Admiral Sir Percy Noble, Commander-in-Chief Western Approaches, reviewed the contact report with emotions oscillating between elation and cautious skepticism. One successful engagement proved nothing conclusively. It might represent fortunate coincidence rather than repeatable capability. But over the following 4 weeks, HMS Watchful achieved 3 additional confirmed U-boat kills and forced 2 others to abort attacks, all using the chalk-based detection system that was being urgently installed on 6 additional destroyers as manufacturing capacity permitted. German submarine commanders reported increasingly disturbing experiences to Admiral Dönitz's operational headquarters. British escorts were detecting and attacking U-boats under conditions where such detection should be impossible. No moon, thermal layers disrupting sonar, submarines operating at depths and ranges conventionally safe from discovery. Multiple boats reported being attacked without any prior indication of British awareness. Depth charges exploding with lethal accuracy, whilst commanders insisted their vessels had maintained perfect operational security. Korvettenkapitän Heinrich Lehmann, commanding U-96, survived 2 consecutive attacks by HMS Watchful and HMS Valiant during late June operations. His after-action report described experiences that contradicted established understanding of British detection capabilities. Both attacks occurred when U-96 was deep, silent, running on battery power that minimized noise and vibration. Both attacks demonstrated uncanny accuracy, forcing desperate evasive maneuvers that nearly exceeded the submarine's structural limits. Lehmann concluded his report with reluctant admission. The enemy possesses detection capability we do not understand. Conventional tactical doctrines may be obsolete. Admiral Dönitz read such reports with growing concern. U-boat operational effectiveness depended fundamentally on stealth, on being able to approach convoys undetected, strike from positions where escort vessels couldn't locate submarines quickly enough to prevent attacks. If British forces had genuinely developed superior detection technology, if German submarines were now vulnerable throughout operational areas previously considered safe, then strategic calculations underlying the entire Atlantic campaign required urgent reassessment. The evidence suggested something genuinely revolutionary had changed. Between 12th June and 31st July 1941, British destroyers equipped with chalk-based detection systems achieved 17 confirmed U-boat kills in the western approaches, plus numerous forced aborts that prevented attacks on convoys. Losses continued elsewhere, but in sectors where experimental systems were deployed, U-boat effectiveness plummeted, whilst British kill rates increased exponentially. The statistical shift was impossible to ignore or attribute to random variation. By early August, the Admiralty had authorized emergency production programs converting every available escort destroyer to the new detection system. Manufacturing capacity limitations meant installation proceeded gradually, but the trajectory was unmistakable. What had begun as a desperate schoolgirl's impossible hypothesis was becoming operational reality that transformed the Battle of the Atlantic from inevitable defeat into contestable struggle. German intelligence services attempted desperately to determine what technology Britain had deployed. Captured Royal Navy personnel were interrogated extensively, but knew only that new detection equipment had been installed. Technical details remained classified beyond their access level. Examination of HMS Watchful's action reports, obtained through signals intelligence, revealed no explanation for the sudden improvement in detection effectiveness. The mystery deepened into major intelligence priority that consumed enormous resources, whilst answers remained frustratingly elusive. The truth that British breakthrough derived from chalk powder and dormant bacteria rather than sophisticated electronics was so improbable that German analysis dismissed it as impossible, even when fragmented intelligence suggested exactly that explanation. The operational assumption remained that Britain had achieved some dramatic improvement in acoustic detection, or perhaps deployed entirely new technology using electromagnetic or thermal detection principles. That a 15-year-old schoolgirl conducting chemistry experiments had inadvertently discovered the key to submarine detection never seriously entered consideration. 14th of September 1941, 11 hours. Dorothy Ainsworth stood on the dock at Portsmouth Naval Base, watching HMS Defender prepare for Atlantic patrol duty with full chalk-based detection systems installed and operational. Commander Thornton had requested her presence at the commissioning ceremony, insisting that the young woman whose discovery had fundamentally altered naval warfare deserved recognition, even if security protocols prevented public acknowledgement of her role. The strategic situation had transformed dramatically since March. U-boat effectiveness had declined 40% in sectors where British destroyers operated with the new detection capability. Convoy losses decreased, whilst German submarine casualties increased to levels that Admiral Dönitz privately admitted were unsustainable. The Battle of the Atlantic remained brutally contested, but the momentum was shifting. Britain's maritime supply lines, which had appeared fatally vulnerable 6 months earlier, were being defended successfully through combination of improved tactics, increased escort numbers, and detection technology that gave British forces decisive advantage in underwater warfare. The operational statistics told the story with merciless clarity. Between June and September 1941, 40 German U-boats had been sunk in the western approaches, an attrition rate exceeding German construction capacity. Dönitz was withdrawing submarines from areas where chalk-based detection was deployed, concentrating operations in Atlantic sectors where British escort coverage remained conventional. The campaign was adapting to new reality. British forces could detect and destroy submerged submarines with reliability that rendered traditional U-boat tactics obsolete. The human cost was equally significant, but measured differently. Convoy losses in protected sectors decreased dramatically. Merchant seamen who'd sailed expecting death discovered that escort vessels could now find and kill submarines before torpedoes struck. The terror that had characterized Atlantic crossings began yielding to cautious hope that perhaps, finally, the odds were shifting away from certain doom toward survivable risk. Professor Harrington stood beside Dorothy on the dock, watching sailors conduct final preparations aboard Defender. His research program had expanded enormously, now employing 30 scientists investigating variations on the chalk detection method, exploring whether other geological formations possessed similar properties, whether synthetic compounds could replicate the bacterial luminescence more reliably. The work continued, but the fundamental breakthrough had already occurred, emerging from sources the academic establishment would never have considered investigating. "You changed the war," Professor Harrington said quietly, watching Defender's crew load depth charges, saved thousands of lives, possibly prevented Britain's defeat. Dorothy remained silent, thinking about her father, about the telegram that had arrived in April, officially confirming his death when SS Merchant Prince had been sunk by U-507 on 23rd February. He died before her discovery could protect his convoy, before chalk-based detection could give escort vessels the capability they desperately needed. The timing felt cruelly arbitrary, as though the universe had withheld salvation until precisely the moment it ceased mattering for the people she'd most wanted to protect. "I was too late," she said finally. "For Dad, for all the men who died before anyone listened. You were 15 years old, conducting homework experiments. That you discovered anything at all was miraculous. That you had the courage to pursue it, despite every reason to doubt yourself, that was extraordinary." The professor's voice was gentle but firm. "Wars are won through accumulation of advantages, small improvements that compound over time. You provided advantage that directly saved lives and shifted strategic balance. The fact that you wish you'd discovered it sooner doesn't diminish what you accomplished." The post-war years would bring fuller recognition, though security classification delayed public acknowledgement for decades. Dorothy received the British Empire Medal in 1945, presented quietly in a ceremony attended by 3 people, with citation describing extraordinary contribution to naval research under wartime conditions. Litidi. The specific nature of her discovery remained classified until 1972, when historians finally connected the mysterious schoolgirl chemist with the dramatic shift in U-boat warfare effectiveness during 1941. By then, Dorothy had completed her doctorate in marine chemistry, spent 25 years working in academic research, and trained 2 generations of students who never knew their professor had fundamentally altered World War II's outcome while still wearing school uniform. She remained consistently modest about her role, insisting that credit belonged equally to Professor Harrington, to Commander Thornton, to the entire research and operational teams who transformed laboratory curiosity into deployable weapon system. But those who knew the full story understood the deeper truth. Breakthroughs don't always emerge from established expertise following conventional methodology. Sometimes they come from unexpected places, from people who don't know enough to recognize impossibility, from determination that refuses to accept that brilliant minds have exhausted possibilities. Dorothy's discovery succeeded precisely because she wasn't trained to know it was impossible, because grief and desperation motivated her to see connections that expert complacency had missed completely. The technological legacy extended beyond immediate wartime application. Chalk-based detection principles informed development of more sophisticated chemical sensing systems throughout the Cold War period. The understanding that geological formations could contain dormant biological agents with practical applications opened entire research fields. Modern biosensor technology traces conceptual lineage directly back to the 15-year-old who noticed that chalk powder glowed in seawater and refused to dismiss the observation as meaningless anomaly. The human legacy proved equally significant. Dorothy's story, once declassified, became testament to the principle that innovation requires diverse perspectives, that excluding voices based on age, gender, or conventional credentials meant potentially missing critical insights. Her experience informed policy changes, encouraging broader participation in scientific research, creating pathways for young researchers to contribute meaningfully rather than waiting decades to earn establishment credibility. Standing on that Portsmouth dock in September 1941, watching warships deploy with detection systems derived from her chemistry homework, Dorothy couldn't predict these future developments. She knew only that her father would never return, that the war continued with brutal intensity despite tactical improvements, that victory remained uncertain despite strategic advantages. The satisfaction of meaningful contribution was tempered by survivors' guilt, and the knowledge that success measured in enemy submarines destroyed meant human lives ended, men drowning in darkness just as her father had drowned. Yet she also understood, with clarity that would strengthen rather than diminish over subsequent decades, that confronting evil required accepting moral complexity. U-boat crews were human beings with families and hopes and fears, identical to British sailors. But they served a regime whose defeat was necessary for civilization's survival, and any contribution that hastened that defeat, that prevented Nazi victory, that saved Allied lives, was justified despite the burden of conscience it imposed. The chalk deposits forming Kent's White Cliffs had existed for millions of years, patiently waiting until their properties might serve purpose beyond geological formation. The bacteria embedded in that chalk had survived epochs of extinction, dormant but not dead, preserving capability that would prove crucial when circumstances demanded. And Dorothy Ainsworth, schoolgirl conducting homework experiments whilst bombs fell and fathers died, had possessed the curiosity, intelligence, and determination to notice what nobody else saw, to pursue implications that seemed impossible, to transform grief into purpose that changed history's trajectory. HMS Defender sounded 3 blasts as she departed Portsmouth Harbour, beginning patrol duty that would result in 5 confirmed U-boat kills over subsequent months, all achieved using detection systems derived from chalk powder and determination. Dorothy watched the destroyer disappear beyond the harbor breakwater, carrying with her the certain knowledge that her discovery mattered, that her father's death had not been meaningless, that ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances possessed capacity to achieve things that seemed impossible until someone actually accomplished them. The real lessons of history emerge not from generals and politicians, but from ordinary individuals who refused to accept defeat when circumstances seemed hopeless. If Dorothy Ainsworth's story resonates with you, if you believe these forgotten chapters of history deserve to be remembered and shared, I'd be deeply grateful if you'd subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on how innovation emerges from unexpected places, or tell us about unsung heroes from your own family history. Together, we'll continue exploring the extraordinary stories of ordinary people who changed the world. Thank you for watching, and remember, the most powerful discoveries often come from those brave enough to question what everyone else assumes is impossible.